There are moments in your life that act like a brand on your soul. They sear themselves into your memory with such heat and pressure that you can feel the ghost of the pain years later, a phantom limb of trauma. For me, that moment wasn't the horrifying sound of my neighbor's panicked voice on the phone. It wasn't the gut-wrenching sight of the orange glow against the night sky that used to be my street. It wasn't even the act of sifting through the blackened, waterlogged ashes of my life, searching for something, anything, that had survived the inferno. No, the moment that truly branded me, the one that is etched into the deepest part of my being, was sitting in the witness box of a packed courtroom. The air in that room was a heavy, stagnant thing, thick with the smell of old wood, floor polish, and the collective anxiety of 100 people holding their breath. I was staring across the sterile expanse at the woman who had done it all, and I was watching her smile at me. It wasn't a nervous smile or a regretful one. It was a smirk, a confident, arrogant, soul-chilling smirk that radiated a single, powerful message. You have nothing on me. In that moment, the universe seemed to narrow to the space between us. I was no longer just Marcus Thorne, a man whose home had been turned into a pile of cinders. I was Fire Marshal Thorne, the state's lead expert witness in the arson of my own life. Every fiber of my training, every lesson learned over 2 decades of walking through the smoldering ruins of other people's tragedies, was screaming at me to remain detached, be objective, present the facts clinically, be the unshakable professional the jury needed to see. But the man inside, the husband who had spent countless nights holding his wife's hand through the ravages of chemotherapy, the hobbyist who had found a fragile peace in the familiar smell of grease and chrome polish, that man wanted to shatter the forced calm of that courtroom. He wanted to stand up and scream about the injustice, the sheer, brazen evil of it all. This story, the one I'm about to tell you, is about what happens when a true predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, mistakenly targets not another sheep, but a sheepdog. It's not just a story about revenge, because revenge is a hollow, fleeting thing. This is a story about the meticulous deconstruction of a manipulator. It's about how the very tools a person like that uses to create chaos, deceit, intimidation, the performance of victimhood, can be turned into the cold, hard instruments of their own destruction, if only you know how to look. This is a lesson in observation, in the almost supernatural power of patience, and in understanding the fatal flaw of every narcissist, their crippling overconfidence. They build their worlds out of lies and illusions, and they never, ever see the real threat until the entire facade is crashing down around them. And by then, it's far too late. To truly understand how a person gets to the point of burning down a neighbor's house over something as trivial as a metal shed, you first have to understand the 2 very different worlds that were destined to collide. My world was quiet, intentionally so. It was a world built on routine and the conscious act of finding solace in the small, tangible things. My wife, Sarah, was in remission from a particularly brutal form of cancer. The word remission itself sounds so clean, so wonderfully final, but anyone who has walked that path knows the reality is a slow, exhausting, 1 foot in front of the other climb back to a semblance of normalcy. Our home, a modest but comfortable 2-story craftsman, wasn't just wood and nails and drywall. It was our recovery ward. It was our fortress of solitude, the one place in the universe where the world couldn't touch us. Every wall held a memory. Every scuff on the floor told a story. It was the backdrop to our life, and now it was the sanctuary for our healing. Every evening, after a day spent analyzing fire patterns and writing reports on human carelessness, I'd retreat to my garage. That space was my own personal cathedral. It wasn't clean or sterile. It was a functioning workshop, and the air hung with a scent I found more comforting than any cologne. A complex blend of motor oil, steel, leather, and chrome polish. It was a perfume of pure, mechanical honesty. I restored vintage motorcycles. For me, it was a form of meditation. The world is a chaotic, unpredictable, and often cruel place. A machine, however, is a different story. A machine is a puzzle with a logical solution. It responds to patience and expertise, taking something broken, something rusted and forgotten, and patiently, piece by piece, bringing it back to vibrant, roaring life. It was more than a hobby. It was how I processed the things I couldn't control, like a rogue cluster of cells in the body of the person I loved most in the world. Each meticulously tightened bolt, each lovingly polished piece of chrome, was a small, tangible victory against the overwhelming chaos of the universe. It was my proof that with enough care and knowledge, things could be made whole again. It was into this quiet, carefully constructed world of healing and hobbies that the first tremor of the earthquake arrived. And her name was Jessica. She moved in across the street with a flurry of activity that felt more like a corporate takeover than a residential move. There were professional moving trucks, teams of landscapers who tore out the existing perfectly lovely garden to install a minimalist landscape of white rocks and severe-looking succulents, and a constant stream of contractors. Her life, it seemed, was meticulously documented on an Instagram feed that chronicled her journey to suburban bliss. Before the last moving box was even unpacked, an email went out to the neighborhood announcing she had been elected as the new HOA president in an emergency session no one remembered being invited to. Her entire brand, both online and in person, was aesthetic purity. Everything was a carefully chosen shade of beige, white, or greige. Her lawn was an unnervingly perfect carpet of emerald green that looked more like astroturf than living grass. Our first real interaction was a welcome basket left on our porch. It was a beautiful wicker basket tied with a rustic burlap bow. Inside, it contained a single, flavorless rice cake, a bottle of ludicrously expensive alkaline water, and a beautifully printed laminated card listing all the HOA aesthetic guidelines we were apparently already in violation of. The list was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It included the non-approved celebratory color palette of our garden gnomes, the non-uniform curvature of our decades-old rose bushes, and the visually disruptive texture of our welcome mat. It was clear from that moment that we weren't dealing with a neighbor. We were dealing with a dictator of domesticity. The real conflict, the spark that would eventually be fanned into a raging inferno, started with my shed. My work as a fire marshal has gifted me with a near-pathological obsession with safety, particularly when it comes to fire. For my motorcycle restoration, I use a variety of chemicals: degreasers, solvents, thinners, paints. Storing them in the garage, even in their original containers, always felt like an unacceptable risk. After weeks of research into commercial-grade safety solutions, I purchased a small, state-of-the-art, fire-resistant metal cabinet. It wasn't really a shed in the traditional sense, more like a large, heavy-duty locker, the kind you'd find in a professional auto body shop. It was designed specifically for the safe storage of flammable materials, engineered down to the specific gauge of its reinforced steel walls and its self-closing, heat-activated air vents. I had a small concrete slab poured behind my garage, a spot completely invisible from the street and even from her house unless you were specifically looking for it. The cabinet was delivered and bolted directly to the slab. It was the responsible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. It was, by every conceivable metric, an act of being a conscientious homeowner and neighbor. But to Jessica, it was a thrown gauntlet, a declaration of war against her beige-tinted vision of suburbia. An email arrived the very next day. The subject line was the single, ominous word, violation. The email, which I still have saved in a dedicated digital file, was a masterclass in bureaucratic intimidation. "Mr. Thorne," it began, "it has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that an unapproved industrial structure has been erected on your property. This metallic eyesore is a gross violation of Article 4, Section B of the Pinewood Estates Aesthetic Covenant, which expressly prohibits non-architecturally harmonious outbuildings. Furthermore, the storage of what can only be assumed are explosive materials in such close proximity to residential structures constitutes a clear and present danger to the safety and property values of our entire community." The email concluded by demanding the immediate removal of the cabinet and included an invoice for a $250 fine. There is a critical lesson here for anyone who finds themselves in the crosshairs of a bureaucratic bully, whether it's an HOA president, a difficult boss, or a petty government official. They count on you not knowing the rules better than they do. Their power is derived from the illusion of authority. They use jargon, citations, and official-sounding language to intimidate you into immediate, unquestioning compliance. They expect you to be scared, to be confused, and to simply give in. My response was polite, professional, and designed to be an utterly devastating legal and factual checkmate. I replied to her, but I also copied the email to the entire HOA board, ensuring there were witnesses to the exchange. I attached 2 PDF documents to my email: the complete town fire code and the relevant sections of the state building code. My email read, "Dear Jessica, thank you for your email and your expressed concern for community safety. The unit in question is not an outbuilding as defined by any local or state statute. It is a UL-listed flammable materials safety cabinet, which is, in fact, mandated by National Fire Protection Association Code 30 for the proper and safe storage of the types of chemicals used in vehicle restoration. Its placement on a non-combustible concrete slab more than 15 feet from any structure not only meets but significantly exceeds all local and state fire codes. To be clear, not storing these materials in such a certified cabinet would be the actual violation and would constitute genuine negligence. Therefore, the aesthetic covenant you cited, while noted, is legally superseded by public safety regulations. The fine is baseless and will not be paid. Should you have any further questions about fire safety protocols, I would be happy to provide you with additional resources. Regards, Marcus Thorne, Fire Marshal." I hit send with a feeling of grim satisfaction. I had not only refuted her claim, I had used my professional expertise to educate her and the entire board. I had laid down a clear, unassailable line based on law and fact. I genuinely thought that would be the end of it. How could it not be? I had proven her wrong in the most definitive way possible. But I was making a classic, critical mistake. I was assuming I was dealing with a reasonable person who cared about rules, safety, or being correct. I was dealing with a narcissist who had just been publicly corrected and professionally humiliated. And for people like her, that is an unforgivable sin. I hadn't ended the conflict. I had just poured a gallon of high-octane gasoline on a hidden, smoldering fire. The war was just beginning. Jessica's response was not to retreat, but to double down. Her tactics, however, shifted with a chilling precision. She could no longer attack me on the grounds of safety. I had taken that weapon away from her. So she began a war of psychological attrition. The violation notices began arriving like clockwork, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, each one a masterpiece of pettiness, a finely crafted instrument of harassment. Improperly stored gardening tools, a single hand trowel left on the porch railing. visible from a second-story window. A $50 fine. Non-approved decorative rock border, rocks we had collected with our grandchildren on a beach trip, around a flower bed. A $75 fine. Excessive bird feeding, a single, modest bird feeder that brought Sarah joy, leading to unsanctioned avian loitering and potential property damage from droppings. A $100 fine. Each notice was a perfectly crafted piece of bureaucratic nonsense, designed for a single purpose: to wear me down, to make my life a living hell of paperwork, appeals, and the constant low-grade stress of being watched. This is where the second lesson comes in, and it is perhaps the most important one I can share. Document everything. Absolutely everything. I created a file on my computer labeled simply HOA. Inside, I created subfolders for every month. I saved every email. I scanned every paper notice. I took dated, time-stamped photographs of the alleged violations, often with a copy of the notice in the frame to prove the absurdity of the claim. I responded to each and every violation, no matter how trivial. My responses were always the same: calm, factual, and devoid of emotion. I would cite the specific HOA bylaws back to her, demonstrating with infuriating logic why her claim was invalid or a gross misinterpretation of the rule. I was building a case, though at the time, I didn't even know what I was building it for. I just knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has seen the catastrophic aftermath of countless bad decisions, that this was not a situation that was going to resolve itself peacefully. I was creating a paper trail, a meticulous record of escalating harassment that would become my most powerful weapon. The true escalation, the moment this conflict crossed the invisible line from vicious neighborhood squabble to something much darker and more personal, was when she began targeting Sarah. My wife, as I mentioned, found her peace and her strength in her garden. Tending to her roses and perennials was her quiet act of defiance against the illness that had tried to take her. It was her way of reclaiming her strength, of watching life flourish after being so close to death. Jessica, with the unerring instinct of a predator, identified this as a vulnerability and began her attack. It wasn't direct at first. It was a campaign of insidious psychological pressure. She would stand on the edge of her perfectly manicured property, phone in hand, pretending to take pictures whenever Sarah was outside. She made a formal complaint to the HOA board about the unpleasant and potentially toxic odor of the organic fertilizer Sarah used, implying it was a health hazard. She told another neighbor, a known gossip, just loud enough for Sarah to overhear from our porch, that our overgrown garden was attracting vermin and lowering property values. To a healthy person, this might be merely annoying. But to a woman in a fragile state of physical and emotional recovery, this felt like a targeted, relentless assault on the one thing that brought her joy and a sense of purpose. It was cruel, it was calculated, and it was brutally effective. Sarah started spending less time outside. She started second-guessing her choice of fertilizer, worrying that she was bothering the neighbors. The light in her eyes, which had been slowly returning, began to dim again. That was the point of no return for me. This was no longer about me or my shed. This was about the sanctity of my wife's recovery. But the act that truly revealed the depths of Jessica's malicious and unhinged nature was the fake gas leak. I was at the station late one evening, finishing a complex report on a warehouse fire, when my work phone buzzed. It was my friend and colleague, Dave Martinez, a battalion chief I'd known since the academy. His voice was laced with a strange mixture of professional amusement and genuine concern. "Mark," he said, trying to sound casual, "you're not going to believe this, but we just dispatched a full crew, engine 12 and ladder 3 to your house. Lights and sirens, the whole deal." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "What's the call?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Anonymous tip," Dave said. A woman sounded absolutely panicked, reported a strong smell of natural gas coming from your property. Said she was terrified because she knew you stored explosive chemicals in your garage and was afraid the whole neighborhood was going to go up. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. She had weaponized my own profession against me. "Dave," I said, my voice low and tight. "It's her." "It's the HOA president. It's a fake call." He sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "Yeah, that's what we figured. She laid it on a little thick. Don't worry. I'm rerouting them now, calling it a false alarm. The guys will just do a slow drive-by. But Mark, listen to me. This is crazy. She's committing a crime here. She's wasting city resources, tying up a frontline engine company. If there had been a real fire somewhere else. This is a big deal. You need to watch your back with this one. She's not just a nuisance anymore. She's unhinged and she's dangerous." When I got home, I found Sarah rattled. A neighbor had called her after seeing the fire trucks on our street. The intended message had been delivered loud and clear. Jessica was willing to weaponize emergency services, to create public spectacles, to terrorize my family. She wasn't just trying to win a fight over a shed anymore. She was trying to publicly and officially declare me a menace to society. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. The woman who was manufacturing a phantom danger was trying to label the safety expert as the existential threat. And that's when the switch flipped in my head. It was a palpable, physical sensation, like a heavy tumbler clicking into place in my mind. I stopped thinking like a homeowner. I stopped thinking like a husband protecting his wife. I stopped being a victim reacting to her attacks. I started thinking like a fire marshal again. I was no longer on the defense. I was opening an investigation, and Jessica Sterling was my primary suspect. My entire professional life is built on a single, unwavering principle. People are predictable, and patterns do not lie. I've seen it 1,000 times. Arsonists, fraudsters, criminals of all stripes. They might think they're being clever, original, and unpredictable, but they almost always have a methodology, a signature. They fall into repeatable patterns of behavior because those patterns have worked for them in the past. That night, fueled by a cold, quiet fury I hadn't felt in years, I sat down at my computer and began to systematically dismantle the pristine, carefully curated life of Jessica Sterling. It's truly amazing what you can find in the public record if you know where to look, what keywords to use, and have the patience to connect the seemingly unrelated dots. I wasn't looking for HOA complaints or social media posts anymore. I was looking for a history. I was looking for the ghost of fires past. Her social media presence was a barren wasteland of meaningless inspirational quotes, filtered selfies, and photos of her beige-on-beige home decor. It was a digital construct, a fictional character she had created. But her digital footprint, the indelible trail of official documents that we all leave behind in our wake, property records, court filings, business licenses, that told a much darker and more interesting story. I started with a simple search for previous addresses. A quick subscription to a public records database showed she had lived in 2 other states over the past 5 years before buying the house across the street. In both cases, she had been a renter, not a homeowner. I took those addresses, one in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, and another in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I ran them through a comprehensive news archive search engine. And then I found it. The first hit, from 3 years prior, was a small, unremarkable article from a local paper in Ohio. The headline read, "Apartment Fire Displaces Local Woman, Community Rallies in Support." The article detailed a tragic late-night kitchen fire that had completely destroyed the apartment of a beloved local yoga instructor, Jessica Sterling. The article quoted her extensively about her devastation. about losing everything she owned. All her cherished memories turned to ash. The final paragraph included a link to a GoFundMe page that had been set up for her by a concerned friend. I clicked the link. The campaign page was a masterwork of emotional manipulation. There were photos of a tearful Jessica standing in front of the burned-out building, clutching a rescued teddy bear. There was a long, maudlin story about her struggles, her dreams, and her resilience in the face of tragedy. The campaign had raised over $30,000. My professional instincts, honed by thousands of fire investigations, were screaming. Kitchen fires are tragically common, but this felt performative. The language was too perfect, the victimhood too polished. I kept digging. I moved on to the North Carolina address. I ran the same search. Bingo. A different local news site, a different byline, but an almost identical story from just 18 months ago. The headline: Electrical Fire Guts Apartment. Community racks up donations for displaced resident. And there she was again. The photos were eerily similar. Jessica Sterling, this time a passionate and inspiring life coach, crying for the camera in front of another smoking ruin. Another GoFundMe, another story of losing absolutely everything. This campaign had been even more successful. It had pulled in close to $50,000 from sympathetic strangers. This is the point in an investigation where all the chaotic, confusing noise coalesces into a single, terrifyingly clear note. This was not a series of unfortunate events. This was a career. This was a business model. Jessica was not an HOA president who was overly concerned with aesthetics. She was a professional victim. She was a serial fraudster who used fire as her primary tool and public sympathy as her payday. Her pattern was clear: move into a community, establish a likable persona, create a catastrophe, monetize the ensuing wave of goodwill, and then vanish before anyone could ask too many questions, leaving a trail of duped donors and baffled insurance adjusters in her wake. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. My petty dispute over a metal shed. It was never, ever about the shed. Her complaints about fire safety, her calling the fire department, her attempts to paint me as a reckless hobbyist. It was all pretext. It was narrative construction. She wasn't just harassing me. She was meticulously crafting a story for the police, the fire department, and the insurance companies, with me, the credentialed fire marshal with a garage full of flammable chemicals, as the perfect, unimpeachable scapegoat. She was going to burn something down. Her own house, most likely, for a massive insurance payout. And she was going to make it look like my fault. She was going to destroy my home as collateral damage, obliterate my professional reputation, and potentially end my career. And then, she would launch her biggest, most lucrative GoFundMe yet, crying to the news. Cameras about the dangerous neighbor who had almost killed her. My identity shifted completely in that moment. I was no longer on the defensive. I was on the hunt. The feeling is one of cold, clarifying, and righteous purpose. You stop reacting to your opponent's moves, and you start planning your own. You stop being a piece on the board, and you become the player. The first step in any forensic investigation is to preserve the potential for future evidence. I knew her plan, or at least the broad strokes of it. Now I had to prepare to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The next day, I took a personal day from work. My captain was concerned, asking if everything was all right at home. I just told him I was dealing with a complicated personal matter that required my full attention. I drove 2 towns over to a specialty surveillance store, the kind that supplies private investigators and law enforcement, not the big-box stores that sell consumer-grade junk. I didn't buy off-the-shelf security cameras that would be destroyed in the first few minutes of a real fire. I used my professional credentials to purchase 2 forensic-grade, heat-resistant, fireproof camera units. These were not your typical Nest cameras. They were encased in a specialized insulated housing designed to protect the internal memory card from temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, even as the camera itself melted and burned around it. The technology isn't common, and it certainly isn't cheap, but for an arson investigator, it's an invaluable tool for capturing a fire's inception. I spent the entire afternoon carefully installing them. One was hidden inside a hollowed-out, decorative birdhouse that I mounted on a tree in my backyard, its lens pointed directly at my garage and the entire side of my house. The other was placed in the attic, nestled behind a gable vent, providing a perfect, clear, downward angle view of my back porch and the rear entrance to my home. They were motion-activated. They recorded in crystal-clear high definition with low-light capability, and they were my only real insurance policy against the storm that I knew, with absolute certainty, was coming. This is the empowerment phase of any conflict. When you make the conscious shift from being the target to being the observer, you take back control. You start setting the trap instead of just waiting for it to spring. That Friday, I told Sarah we were going to visit her sister for a long weekend. I told her I wanted to get her away from the stress of the neighborhood, away from Jessica's constant, passive-aggressive scrutiny. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that I was evacuating my most precious asset from a building I now considered a future crime scene. As we drove away that afternoon, Sarah asleep in the passenger seat, I looked back at my house in the rearview mirror. I looked at the garden she had so lovingly tended, at the garage that held my passions, at the front porch where we'd drunk countless cups of coffee, and I said goodbye to it. I knew with a heavy heart that I might never see it standing again. The call came on Saturday night, just after 2:30 a.m. It was my next-door neighbor, Bill, a kind, retired man whose voice was frantic and cracking with panic, barely audible over a terrifying roar in the background that I recognized instantly as the sound of a fully involved structure fire. "Marcus! Marcus, for God's sake! Your house! Oh my God, your house is on fire!" I kept my voice preternaturally calm, a skill honed over years of dealing with people on the worst day of their lives. "Bill, it's okay. Are you and Mary safe?" He stammered that they were. "Good," I said, my voice firm and reassuring. "Stay back. Stay far back and let the fire department do their work. Sarah and I are safe. We're out of town." I hung up the phone and looked at Sarah, who was now sitting bolt upright in our hotel bed, her face pale and etched with confusion in the dim light. I took her hand. It was ice cold. "It's the house," I said quietly. "It's on fire, but we're safe, and I've got it under control." I don't think she understood what I meant by that last part, how I could possibly have a 5-alarm fire under control. But she nodded, trusting me. We drove back in the pre-dawn darkness, the glow in the sky visible from 10 miles away, a sickening, pulsing orange against the black. It's a sight I've seen 100 times in my career, arriving on scene after scene. But it is a profoundly, fundamentally different experience when it's your own life, your own memories, being consumed and turned into smoke and light. My street was a chaotic, surreal tapestry of flashing red and blue lights, thick yellow hoses snaking across the pavement like giant serpents, and the grim, determined faces of my colleagues, the men and women I'd trained with, now battling a massive blaze at my address. My house was a skeleton, its black bones silhouetted against a hellish orange sky. The roof was gone. The second story was collapsing into the first. The garage, my sanctuary, was a twisted, glowing heap of molten metal. My motorcycles, my restoration projects, my therapy, they were gone. The air was thick with the acrid chemical stench of destruction, a smell I knew all too well. the smell of a lifetime's worth of belongings being violently transformed into toxic gas and carcinogens. I saw her then, standing across the street on her perfect lawn, wrapped in a pristine white blanket with a designer mug in her hand, performing for a small, horrified crowd of neighbors. She was crying. I'm sure they were real tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of triumph and relief. She was already giving her statement to a local news reporter who had shown up, her voice catching with perfectly rehearsed, theatrical grief. I could hear snippets of it on the wind, carried over the hiss of the water cannons. So worried. I always told him, those dangerous chemicals, it was just a tragedy waiting to happen. She was a maestro conducting a symphony of deceit. While my life smoldered and collapsed into a pile of ash, her GoFundMe was probably already drafted and ready to post. The next morning, I met with the lead detective on the case, a good, solid cop named Frank Miller, who I'd worked with on a dozen cases before. The scene was a water-logged, smoking ruin, a black hole where my home used to be. The preliminary assessment from the on-scene commander, just as Jessica had so perfectly planned, was leaning toward an accidental fire originating in the garage. "Looks like maybe a spark from some of your grinding equipment hit some solvent rags, Mark," Miller said, his tone heavy and apologetic. "Once it got going with all that fuel in there, it's a damn shame." I let him finish. I let him walk me through the initial findings, nodding quietly. Then I looked him in the eye and said, "It was arson, Frank. And I know who did it." He gave me a skeptical, pitying look, the look a cop gives anyone who is grasping for answers in the midst of a tragedy. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I reached into the evidence bag I was carrying. Inside was the small, soot-stained, but miraculously intact metal box from the birdhouse camera. I opened it and carefully removed the tiny, fragile SD card with a pair of tweezers. "The fire started at 2:17 a.m., I said calmly, my voice devoid of emotion. The perpetrator used a yellow crowbar to pry open the back door of the garage. She spread a gasoline-based accelerant in a classic heavy pour pattern from the back porch directly into the garage, focusing on the area beneath my main workbench to mimic an electrical source. She used a simple road flare as an ignition device. Her name is Jessica Sterling. She lives in the beige house across the street, and this is the third suspicious fire she's been the primary beneficiary of in the last 5 years. It's all on this card." Detective Miller stared at the tiny piece of plastic in my hand, like it was the Holy Grail. The look on his face, that slow, incredible transition from sympathetic doubt to wide-eyed shock, and finally to a grim, predatory focus, was one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life. The trap, which had been so patiently set, had finally been sprung. The wheels of justice are often said to turn slowly, but when they are greased with high-octane fuel like crystal-clear, high-definition video evidence of a felony in progress, they move with the speed and force of a freight train. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, search warrants, and legal proceedings. Jessica was arrested at her home, an event conveniently captured by the same news crew she had performed for on the night of the fire. Her house, the one she had leveraged to the hilt for the massive insurance policy she was about to cash in on, was searched from top to bottom. In her garage, they found canisters of the same brand of gasoline I had identified from the video footage. In her laptop's browser history, they found searches for how to burn down a house and make it look accidental, and average home fire insurance payout. In her documents folder, they found draft after draft of her GoFundMe victim statements, each one more heart-wrenching and duplicitous than the last. The evidence was a tidal wave, an overwhelming avalanche of guilt. And yet, her arrogance remained a fortress. She pleaded not guilty. She secured a public defender and prepared to fight, utterly convinced that her story of being the concerned, terrified neighbor was more believable than my far-fetched and vengeful conspiracy theory. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the fight she was in. She thought it was about her word against mine. She failed to realize it was about her actions against an incorruptible digital record. Which brings us back, full circle, to that courtroom. Back to that single defining moment. Me on the stand, her at the defendant's table with that infuriating, self-assured smirk. She truly believed she could charm a jury, that she could cry on cue and convince 12 ordinary people that she was the real victim in all of this. What she didn't understand, what manipulators like her never understand, is that you can't charm a video camera. You can't lie to a timestamp. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense young woman named Elise Carter, dimmed the courtroom lights. A large projection screen on the wall flickered to life. "Fire Marshal Thorne," she began, her voice echoing in the silent room. "Can you please walk the jury through the events recorded on this camera, beginning at 2:12 a.m. on the night of the fire?" My voice was steady, a monotone calibrated by years of testifying in court. All the anger, all the grief, all the white-hot rage had been compressed into a diamond-hard core of professional focus. "At 2:12 a.m., I began, my eyes locked on the screen where the ghost of my home was still standing. The defendant, Jessica Sterling, is seen, approaching the rear of my property from the side yard. She is wearing dark clothing, gloves, and a hoodie that partially obscures her face. However, if you'll note her footwear, she is wearing a distinctive pair of bright pink running shoes. The same shoes, Your Honor, that the defendant is wearing in no fewer than 17 posts on her public Instagram feed." A murmur went through the jury box. I continued, narrating the silent movie of my life's destruction as it played out in horrifying detail for the jury. "Here, she is using a yellow crowbar to force the deadbolt on my back door. The timestamp reads 2:14 a.m. She enters the house. 2 minutes later, she re-emerges from the garage carrying a red 2-gallon gasoline canister. Note the pour pattern. She is not splashing it randomly. She's creating what we in the field call an accelerant trail, a fire highway, designed to ensure rapid and complete combustion and to lead the eventual investigation toward a specific point of origin. She is deliberately spreading it toward the location of my main workbench, where my electrical power tools are, in a clear attempt to suggest an electrical fault as the fire's cause. I felt like a surgeon, coolly and clinically dissecting a malignant tumor for a room full of medical students. I pointed out every technical detail, explaining the science of arson, flashpoints, vapor density, burn patterns, in a calm, clear voice that left absolutely no room for doubt. I explained how the specific type of road flare she used as an ignition device was a common choice for professional arsonists because it burns hot enough to vaporize any potential fingerprints and then conveniently consumes itself in the blaze, destroying the evidence of its own existence. The jury was transfixed, their faces illuminated by the flickering light from the screen. Jessica's smirk had long since vanished. It was replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of pure shock. It was the look of a master manipulator realizing, for the first time in her life, that she had been completely and utterly outplayed. She was watching her own meticulous planning become a perfectly documented, feature-length, career-ending felony. The final piece of my testimony was presenting the evidence of her past. The news articles from Ohio and North Carolina were entered into evidence. The financial records from the multiple GoFundMes subpoenaed from the company were displayed for the jury, showing the tens of thousands of dollars that had flowed into her accounts. The insurance claims she had filed were laid out, one after another. I laid out the pattern for the jury, showing them with charts and timelines that this was not a moment of passion or a simple neighborly dispute gone wrong. This was a cold, calculated professional operation. This was her job. Her defense attorney, an overwhelmed young man who knew he was defending an impossible case, tried to object. He tried to paint me as a vengeful man, obsessed with his neighbor who could have doctored the footage. But the state's digital forensics expert had already testified that the video was authentic and untampered with. My testimony lasted for 4 grueling hours. By the end of it, the energy in the courtroom had completely and irrevocably shifted. There was no doubt left in that room. There was only the quiet, heavy, suffocating certainty of guilt. As I stepped down from the witness stand, my work done, I allowed myself one brief glance at Jessica. Her face was a ruin. The carefully constructed mask of the perfect, poised influencer had crumbled away, revealing the terrified, cornered predator underneath. In that moment, to my surprise, I felt no satisfaction, no joy, just a profound, bone-deep, weary sense of justice finally, inexorably being done. The jury, after all that, took less than an hour to come back. The verdict was guilty, on all counts: first-degree arson, insurance fraud, and reckless endangerment. The judge, a woman known for her stern demeanor, looked at Jessica and called her a parasite on the fabric of community, preying on the very best of human instincts for the very worst of reasons. She sentenced her to the maximum allowed by state law, life in prison with the first possibility of parole in 30 years. Justice, I have learned, is not an ending. It is not a destination. It is a clearing of the ground, a scorched earth event that allows for the possibility of something new to be built in its place. In the 2 years since the trial, Sarah and I have rebuilt. The insurance money, which was substantial, came through without issue. We also won a significant settlement from a civil suit against Jessica's frozen assets, which included the house across the street. We built a new house on the same plot of land, on the same foundation. But it's different. It's stronger. It's brighter. It's more open. We designed it together, every room, every window, a home built not on old, tainted memories, but on the unwavering promise of new ones. But I didn't just rebuild my house. I rebuilt my sanctuary. The new garage is twice as large as the old one. Its walls are lined with state-of-the-art tools and equipment. But it's not just for me anymore. Above the big bay doors is a simple, hand-carved wooden sign that reads, "The Pinewood Community Workshop." With the settlement money, I outfitted it not just for me, but for everyone. On the weekends, I open it up to the neighborhood. I teach free classes on basic auto mechanics, on small engine repair, on home electrical basics, and most importantly, on residential fire safety. I show people how to properly store flammable chemicals. I show them how to inspect and maintain their smoke detectors. I show them the proper way to use a fire extinguisher. I took the very knowledge that Jessica tried to weaponize and twist to destroy me, and I gave it away freely to my community, empowering them to protect themselves and each other. A young kid from down the street who was getting into trouble, skipping school, now spends his Saturdays with me, learning how to meticulously rebuild a classic motorcycle carburetor. He's found his focus, he's found his purpose. That, to me, is the real victory. That's the real lesson here, the one I want you to take away from this story. The greatest victory isn't in watching your enemy fall, it's in what you choose to build from the ashes they leave behind. Bullies, manipulators, predators like Jessica, they are fundamentally empty. They thrive on creating chaos and feeding on the emotional aftermath. They win only when they succeed in turning you into a permanent victim, when they consume your life with the poison of anger and fear. You win when you take the fire they started and use its heat to forge something stronger, something better, something that benefits more than just yourself. You win when you transform your pain into purpose. So, if you're facing a battle like this in your own life, if you're dealing with someone who seems intent on tearing your world down piece by piece, remember this. Be the investigator of your own life. Document everything. Observe the patterns. Trust your professional instincts, but verify with cold, hard facts. Turn their tactics into your evidence. And never, ever let them steal your fundamental ability to build. Because in the end, that is a power they can never have. They can only destroy. You can create. And that, in any contest, will always be the ultimate, enduring triumph.